In Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, we always hear about the term pressure. But what does that mean? We hear pressure passing, 100 kilos side control. We want to smash our opponent. We want to make ourselves heavier. I'm not going to do you the disservice of just saying that it's invisible jiu-jitsu and by time of the match you're going to get better. Pressure has a formula and it can be defined and it can be broken down. And in this episode of the Science Behind Your Jiu Jitsu, we're going to be talking about pressure in great detail.
How would you like to be a full-time sprawl mark greeter?
Is there a chance for advancement?
No.
Woohoo! No pressure!
Pressure is the force per unit area exerted by an object against a surface with which it is in contact. Now, pressure is force divided by area. So if we look at this surface and we see the board being pushed into it, you can see the direction of the force and you can see the surface area of the board. This is important to know even if you hate math, because what's interesting about pressure is that pressure can increase by force being increased, but it can also be increased by the surface area being reduced. And that's probably the easiest way, where you're looking at decreasing the surface area to increase the pressure. There's no change in force at all. And so that's going to take still an understanding of how to position your body with pressure passing, with full mount, side control. But when you know how to reduce the surface area, you're going to increase the pressure and you're going to feel much heavier than you actually are.
Pressure too high. Tank must be shut down manually. Oh, stupid bird! I never should have put you in charge!
If we look at trying to put pressure onto our opponent, if I create a large surface area while doing it, it spreads out the force and it's going to be easier or more comfortable for my opponent. So in this circumstance, if I just lay my chest on top of Kevin, recite the alphabet right now.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H.
It's relatively easy to do so because I've spread on this large surface area. But if I now look to, like the main way we're going to look to reduce our surface area and increase pressure is by using our shoulder. So from here now, Kevin, start reciting the alphabet.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
By me just turning myself and using my shoulder to drive into his diaphragm rather than trying to use my entire chest, I am now increasing pressure in that specific spot. That's an example that you see taught all over the place. Same like if I'm in side control and I want to start trying to abuse and break his posture, then by using my shoulder and leading, I'm able to increase a lot of pressure by starting to blade myself so that my other shoulder starts to align slightly more over top. Like I'm not trying to turn myself like this, but just reduce it that if I'm here, I have force going into his chest through my chest, and then I have force going into his jaw through my shoulder. I want to reduce the area so that now it's all going into my shoulder as much as possible. It's not going to be perfect. All we're trying to do is just make these increases, and sometimes we choose other forms of control in the sense, well, I'm not going to have as much pressure, but I want to be a little more tight with my elbows, and I want to have control of the gi, etc. There's so many things. So this is just some ideas on how to increase that pressure. If I was in full mount, same thing. If I want to use like my shoulders, but also with my hips here. If I wanted to be able to turn my hip and try and lead a little more with one side of my hip, being able to control if I feel he's trying to go up one direction. If I'm here, I have my left and right hip both making contact with him, which is great. I have a ton of control here in full mount. But if he's trying to turn one specific direction and he's trying to lift his right hip right now, if I turn myself and try and increase the pressure with my left hip to keep that hip stapled down to the mat, I'm not really making too much contact with him with my right leg or my left hip. I'm obviously not opening my leg up like this because it's going to allow him to get out of full mount. But as I'm here, if he starts to turn onto his side right now, and I keep it equal, I end up getting off balance. But here, as he starts to try and lift himself, I drop my left hip down and I'm increasing the pressure on that side. And by also using this hook, I'm able to create a pulling force to increase force at the same time. So now here, trying to turn to the side going, pressure is great. If he tries to go to the other side, I switch and I increase the force. If we're looking at stuff like pressure passing, here like the over-under pass, if I am just positioned like this, even if I have my feet up off the mat, I have all my weight going through my chest quite equally and into his hips. So here, recite the alphabet, Kevin.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H.
By me just trying to turn myself a little bit more, while controlling my center of gravity and momentum, I'm able to reduce the surface area and increase the pressure.
You're still retaining a lot of grump in these joints. More pressure.
Whoa.
So the next way that we can increase pressure is by increasing force. But there's a bit more to that. When we're talking about increasing force, in one of the earlier episodes of Science Behind Your Jiu Jitsu, I talked about force vectors. We're usually looking at driving a 45-degree angle down into our opponent because we have gravity, which is just going to be a constant force vector straight down, pulling our bodies towards the earth. And then we have a more horizontal force in which we are driving into our opponent. We can generate more force by obviously driving into our opponent because our opponent will get kind of wedged in place through whether wedges of our own or friction against the mats, the angle that we're driving in, we can. But if we were to drive just consistent horizontal force into our opponent, we might just end up sliding them more around the mats. So what we need to do is we need to try and increase vertical force as well, the downward force. And unfortunately, we can't do that by just making ourselves heavier. We can't just bloat ourselves up and make our body mass greater. So, and we don't have the ability to say, like, if I had the ceiling only like 5 feet high and I'd be able to position myself to drive off of the ceiling, or we've all cheated once in a while when we end up too close to the wall. You can base off the wall. We could actually start to increase force that way. So we need to learn how to maximize how to place our body weight on top of our opponent without compromising our base, because it doesn't help us to lean all our weight on top of our opponent and get reversed. The other thing that we can do is, because we realize we can't push ourselves downwards, we can create pulling motions, and we can do that by using the gi or by using underhooks, different kinds of control schemes to create that pull. And that's what we're going to look at next.
Bull, Duchess! Bull!
What town did we just crush?
Shelbyville.
If I'm on my knees, I have my center of gravity at my hips, and I have a lot of weight transferring into my legs. So even here, if I'm starting to try and drive some force into Kevin, even if I try and reduce my surface area, the problem is that I have a lot of weight transferring just uselessly into my legs into the ground. What I want to do is I want to be able to lift myself up so that I can start to stack more of my weight, more of my center of gravity on top of Kevin. Even by just lifting one of my legs up and pushing myself forward, this is going to make a huge difference. The key thing that we got to be super careful about is that I don't allow my opponent to control my center of gravity. If I'm out here, the great thing about this for a beginner is that if Kevin tries to roll me to his left, it's basically impossible because I'm all the way over here. But if I start getting too carried away with the idea of pressure, and I put my center of gravity on top of Kevin, that's going to be a bad thing. It becomes like Ryan Hall talked about the idea of like a cat with a ball of yarn, where you're just going to be stacking yourself over top of your opponent too much, and they're going to be able to control you. So there's that fine line. This is why when it comes to, like, say, pressure passing, we don't typically teach pressure passing to beginners. We wait until they're at a higher level, preferably even blue belt, because they need to learn how to control their bodies and their momentum, because people just get too carried away with pressure and they just end up throwing themselves at their opponents and getting reversed, getting swept, etc. So we want to think about placing more of our weight on. If I even just look at, say, Zuri Tommy, here, fine control. I've reduced my surface area by blading my body and putting myself on top of Kevin's diaphragm rather than, say, having my chest, because I'm more narrow on the side of my body. But right now I have all my weight going into my butt for the most part. I'm still putting force into Kevin. But then here's the difference where Kevin, recite the alphabet.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
All I'm doing is just slightly lifting my butt off the ground so that now I don't have the force going into my lazy ass into the ground. I have a tripod in the sense that I have this foot planted, live toes planted here, and I have my weight shifting into Kevin. I can have my hips lifted, but if I have my weight mostly over here into my legs, recite the alphabet, Kevin.
A, B, C, D.
It's gone again. But if I shift myself back over, I can start to increase that force. But if I shift myself too far, I'm going to get reversed again. The one example I talked about was mount. Where here, if I have a box around his hips, this is great, and this is not wrong at by any means. But right now, I have weight transferring into my knees into the ground. Maybe I want to have the space eliminated. Maybe I want to have my hips disconnected from his There's reasons to do this, but if I want to just put increased pressure, I like to start taking my knees off the mat so that now my hips are completely in contact with his. So that now when he tries to bridge, there's much more force that he has to deal with. And then the other example that I was talking about is to be able to create a pulling force. In this circumstance, I'm able to create a pulling force to pull my hips down to try and increase that pressure so that now if he tries to bridge, the pressure is much more significant. And then if I angle myself, depending on the side he's trying to drive, I'm now reducing the surface area. This is harder in no-gi in certain circumstances, but even things like underhooks is going to allow us to be able to pull. The easiest example here would be, say, knee ride position, when you see guys that are run to be just awful to their training partner. I'm sorry, Kevin. But as I'm here, and if I grab that gi, Kevin, recite the alphabet here.
A, B, C, D.
I can start to pull myself down into Kevin and increase the force of my knee. And as I start to spike my knee more, I'm reducing the surface area, and so now pressure is starting to increase dramatically. That's what we're doing there with mount, pulling with our legs here. That's what we're trying to do even just with like an underhook, where I'm not necessarily gonna be able to increase my pressure significantly by pulling. Like I could probably pull myself down a little bit, but I'm definitely holding myself here. But even just that difference of me being here like this versus now me being able to grab his collar and engage and pull him in, I'm gonna be able to increase pressure, even if it's just incremental. We just want to be careful and kind of know when we're going to do some of those motions, because obviously if I'm just pulling the whole time statically, I'm going to be burning my arms out. And so it's not necessary to do all the time, but certainly in circumstances I might be here and think, okay, I'm going to blade my body so that I'm reducing my surface area to increase pressure. I want to make sure my center of gravity is off the ground, shifting a little more towards my opponent, so I'm increasing pressure that way. And then if Kevin starts to try and explode in some direction, now I'm going to pull myself in and down into him, engaging my arm, engaging here, maybe engaging in the back of his head, pulling myself in, just for that burst. And then when Kevin gives up, because the pressure is just great and I'm not moving, I can relax again. I can start to use gravity, and I'll start to work to shift myself into better positions. So a lot of different ways that we can talk about, but when we're looking at increasing force with pressure, we are looking at either creating a pulling direction down into our opponent, whether that's using the gi or just using their body. And we are looking at trying to control our center of gravity and minimize how much of that force is transferring wastefully into the ground, and make sure that we're putting as much weight as possible in a controlled manner onto our opponent.